My name is Lucy Ann Haslam. I'm the co-founder and director of United in Compassion and the co-founder and director of the Australian Medicinal Cannabis Association.
Now, would you like to make an opening statement to the committee?
My attendance is another aspect of what's become a very long and unsolicited journey that came about purely because I was the mother of a young man who developed stage 4 bowel cancer. Had it not been for Dan's illness, I would not have walked this road. However, in many ways, I feel like I was chosen to do so. My background is in nursing, and I owned and operated a successful home nursing and respite agency for many years, during which time I was involved in the day-to-day struggles of many patients with a wide range of conditions that resulted in them requiring home-based support and nursing care. This gave me tremendous insight into the human suffering and vulnerability of many Australian patients of all ages, and especially insight into the shortcomings of community supports and many Western treatments. My husband's background was in policing, and most of his 35-year career spent in drug law enforcement. That produced a family that was empathic for those who suffered, yet strict in attitude towards drug abuse. Prior to our son's experience with cannabis in 2014, I didn't realise that the lines were so blurred. And for that, I can only blame my personal exposure to misinformation that was both historical and based on propaganda and completely without scientific basis. So here I am still fighting for better patient access to medicinal cannabis now 7 years since Dan's death. I'm here because I think it's one area where discrimination of the most vulnerable remains shamefully high, and where there is so much capacity to relieve suffering, such as which we observe with Dan. I'm not an expert, and in many ways I'm the least qualified member of the organisations I've founded to find a quest to solutions, but I've walked the walk. I know the distress of seeing unnecessary and unrelieved suffering in someone you love. I've put myself on the other side of the law to relieve that suffering, and I've experienced the fear that invites. I've experienced the lack of critical education as a health professional and seen firsthand how discriminatory laws and excessive regulatory burden have impacted on our most vulnerable and kept many reliant on the illicit market for the supply of cannabis as medicine. Equally alarming is the lack of government initiative to recognise and address this fact.
Given the challenges that you had accessing cannabis, you had to make a decision to source it illegally. Could you tell us a bit about what that journey was like for your family? Because I imagine it wouldn't have been an easy decision to have come to.
In one respect, it wasn't made lightly, but in another it was. Once we saw the benefit that it brought to Dan, it was instant relief. It was something that we weren't expecting. We had no preconceptions, but when Dan first tried cannabis after his chemotherapy, it was as close to a miracle as I've ever seen. And I don't say that lightly. And I'm not a believer that cannabis is all things to all people. But for Daniel, it was everything. It made the difference between having to be hospitalised every time he had his cancer treatment. And when he was hospitalised for the duration of the treatment for 3 days every fortnight. And he would lie in the dark. He would be on a drip. He wouldn't eat. He wouldn't drink. He wouldn't speak to anybody. He wouldn't watch TV or read. He would just lie there and try and get through it. So that no longer became necessary. He was able to come home from hospital straight away. He was able to have some vaporized cannabis, and he was able to eat. He was able to maintain his weight. He was able to enjoy food again. And later on, he wanted to use cannabis to try and treat his cancer. And that meant taking it in a different form. That meant ingesting cannabis oil in rather large quantities. And I was not going to stand in his way if that was what he wanted to do. Basically, all his other treatments were failing. So I agreed to that, and I bought him quite large quantities of cannabis, which he made himself into cannabis oil. And that in itself was scary, knowing that your terminally ill son is out in the back shed late into the night cooking up cannabis in what was quite archaic and probably dangerous circumstances. But we did it, and we did it because it gave him some hope, but it gave him a lot of relief. And it really saved the taxpayer a lot of money because he wasn't hospitalised as he was regularly. He was able to stay at home, and he had a much better quality of life.
And so these experiences led to the establishment of United in Compassion?
They did. When New South Wales Premier Mike Baird said that he was going to change the law in New South Wales, I had been doing some fundraising to support my local member if he was to table a private member's bill. And because I didn't need to do that, I had $50,000 that I had raised. And so I decided that the best thing that I could do was to put that into education of the wider public. And Mike Baird matched my $50,000. And that's when we put on the first symposium. So that was the first time that that anyone really in the country had introduced international speakers to the country to talk about their experiences on medical cannabis. And I think it was probably at that point that we started to realise that we were very far behind what was going on around the world. As a registered nurse, where the only thing I'd been taught about medical cannabis, that it was a dangerous gateway drug that frequently caused schizophrenia, and there was nothing more that I ever learnt about it. And so that was the attitude that I came to medical cannabis with. And I realised that there was very little knowledge or education on the endocannabinoid system, and that was a really glaring omission from the medical curricula for doctors, nurses, pharmacists, and pretty well everyone in between. Really understanding, though, that there is a void there and that there is a lack of scientific evidence because of basically the war on drugs and the prohibition that has been very much around any research into cannabis for almost 80 years. The only research that was funded into cannabis was into the harms, and so there is very much, a vacuum in terms of clinical trial evidence. Many in the health profession are sceptical of medicinal cannabis based on their lack of knowledge, and that really they need to support each other as peers to try and encourage a broader uptake of prescribing of medical cannabis. I made a poster of a flowchart that one of the journalists had put together of the individual pathways for each state. And to have that printed out so it was readable, I literally had to stand on a desk and hold it at the top of my head and let it drop to the floor. Such was the pathway that the doctor had to go through. And we all know that doctors are fairly time poor. And so not many doctors at that stage were prepared to put in the amount of work that was required to make an individual application for an individual patient. But one of the problems was that for each application they made, it was only for one product, one type of product. Now, prescribing cannabis medicines for patients is very much, it's a trial and error sometimes. It's a very much an individual, a personalised medicine. So there are many types of cannabis, many formulations, many preparations and many delivery methods. And not all types of cannabis suit all patients or all conditions. So there's a bit of trial and error. But each time a doctor applied for a medicine, which the patient would bear the full cost for, and the patient would then get and try, if it didn't work, then it was a whole new application to try another product made by a different company that may be on a different form of base that the patient may tolerate better, or maybe a different strength. So each time the doctor had to make a small change, it meant another application.
There's a further penalisation which occurs using cannabis when you're caught driving with THC in the system. How are you actually responding to that? Or what's your experience with that? And how do you think it impacts upon medical cannabis?
Well, I don't think patients should have to choose between having their symptoms relieved and having the capacity to drive. So I think it's a very discriminatory system at the moment. So we don't test for impairment of drivers. We just test for the presence of THC. There is the Drive Change campaign happening. I'm an ambassador for the Drive Change campaign. And basically we're seeking really not for cannabis patients to be singled out or given preferential treatment in any way, shape or form, but really to be treated in the same way as other patients who take potentially impairing medications such as opiates or benzodiazepines. So the onus should be on the patient. If they feel impaired, they should not drive. But the problem with the situation is there is no test for impairment. There is just a test for the presence of THC is enough to make a patient who's been legally prescribed the product lose their licence and criminally charged. Many patients, I believe, don't actually go down the road of medical cannabis because they can't risk driving. Many people drive for their occupation. People in rural and remote communities need their cars because of lack of community transport. It's something that really is essential to all Australians.
Can you extend that concept into the range of workforce experiences, banning from work or losing a job because of THC use?
There's a lot of misinformation of employers. So, I have heard of patients who drive for a living who lose their capacity to drive because, and they could be using something like cannabidiol, which is unimpairing, but because of the lack of information around what actually constitutes impairment in driving, a lot of employers just make that connection. They're using a cannabis product, therefore they shouldn't be driving, and so that impacts on their work, on their capacity to work. I've heard of police officers who have been using cannabis products legally prescribed, who've had their weapon and badge removed and been relegated to desk duties. We've heard of truck drivers who've been unable to drive. So it's a really big problem.
These issues that you brought up, what do you think could be done to make this problem less? Any suggestions that you would put to us that we could recommend to reduce the consequences that you have just mentioned?
There needs to be education at the political level, and that's probably through all states and territories, and it probably very much needs to focus on state police forces. I think there are still many within the police who don't understand impairment versus presence of and the implications of that. Trying to lift some of the restrictions around advertising so that the public can be better informed. I think that's really important. And I think that there should be, and again, it's probably a federal government thing, but there should be capacity within the government to try and alleviate the cost burden on patients. We know that cannabis can't be subsidised on the PBS because it's not registered on the ARTG. That creates a very big cost problem for patients, with the added cost burden of doctors charging sometimes quite large amounts to do an application and repeats. There's a high cost burden. So I think it would be great if something could be done within Medicare to alleviate some of that cost. It's something that I will always be sorry for, the fact that the government chose to amend the Narcotic Drugs Act rather than to implement the Regulator of Medicinal Cannabis Bill, which was first tabled. And I think all the problems that foreshadowed have played out. And now we have a nightmare to try and fix. But I welcome you and I thank you for any small part that you may play in trying to alleviate some of the obstacles for patients.